Welcome. My name is Mark Squires, Environmental Health and Safety Advisor with U.S. Compliance Corporation, and today we're going to be discussing general environmental awareness. Specifically, the topics we're going to discuss today include W.W. Williams environmental policy. We'll talk about water quality, oil pollution prevention, air quality. We'll discuss hazardous waste as well as universal waste and used oil. And we'll wrap this up with a discussion on basic spill response protocol. With regards to the W.W. Williams environmental policy, we believe in maintaining a balance between profitability and environmental consciousness, meaning we must protect our natural resources and comply with governmental regulations which will aid in the preservation of the environment. The main goals of the W.W. Williams environmental policy are as follows. First, we want to achieve and sustain compliance with federal, state, and local laws and regulations. Secondly, we want to practice conservation in order to protect our natural resources. 3, we want to prevent pollution, and we do so through the minimization of waste, maximization of products, and practice recycling when possible. If you have any concerns with your facility's adherence to the guidelines set forth in this presentation, please do not hesitate to contact your site CSM. We want you to be alert for potential problems and speak up if you identify potential environmental issues. We also want to make sure you're familiar with the company's spill response protocol, which we will later discuss in this presentation. Next, we will discuss water quality, specifically the preservation of good water quality. In order to preserve water quality, please do not dispose of any oil, chemicals, or any other materials into stormwater drains or sanitary drains. Stormwater and sanitary are the two primary types of sewers found at W.W. Williams facilities. Specifically, stormwater drains flow to creeks, rivers, lakes, and ponds, and are not normally treated. Sanitary sewer is that which your restroom waste, hand washing sinks, flows back into the environment, but only after mechanical, chemical, and ultraviolet treatments. Most W.W. Williams facilities are equipped with an oil water separator, which is designed to remove oils and trap sediment before discharging into the sanitary sewer system for further treatment. The drains from most W.W. Williams wash bays are plumbed to a oil water separator to minimize the amount of material that is being discharged into the sanitary sewer system. Finally, some best management practices in order to minimize stormwater pollution include keeping dumpsters covered, minimizing any outdoor storage, tarping necessary outdoor storage, and if we are storing drums outdoors, we want to utilize drum covers as you see pictured on this slide. Also covered under the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water Act is oil pollution prevention. Oil pollution prevention is captured under what is known as a spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plan, which is required at most W.W. Williams sites. Specific criteria which would make a site applicable would be the aggregate storage of greater than 1,320 gallons of oil-based materials in containers sized 55 gallons or larger, and in the event of a catastrophic release from one of these containers, oil can be reasonably expected to enter into navigable waters, most often through stormwater drains. These spill prevention, control, and countermeasure regulations require the following. A site-specific plan, which looks to address the prevention of an oil release, the control of an oil release, and countermeasures available to be put into place in the event that we do have an oil release. These plans are designed to document the inventory of applicable materials stored on site. It sets forth the requirements for documented container inspections, which are to be performed on a monthly basis. It sets forth the requirement that we maintain 100% secondary containment for oil-based materials. It also sets forth bulk oil transfer requirements, such as chocking the tires of the transfer vehicle and making sure that trained W.W. Williams personnel are monitoring all transfers. It requires that we maintain spill kits, making sure that they are adequately stocked and periodically inspected. And it also sets forth requirements that we report spills if they meet certain criteria or if they exceed certain thresholds. So that wraps up water pollution prevention. Now let's move on and talk about preventing air pollution. Overall, air pollution is a relatively low level of concern for W.W. Williams since paint booth operations have ceased at all W.W. Williams sites. However, the potential to pollute the atmosphere still exists through vehicle exhaust, use of aerosol products, parts washer solvent evaporation, grinding, which can introduce particulate into the atmosphere, and welding, which creates fumes amongst other materials which may become airborne. Specific controls that can be employed in order to minimize the amount of air pollutants which enter the atmosphere as a result of operations at W.W. Williams include forbidding the unnecessary idling of vehicles. We understand it's sometimes necessary to idle vehicles, but please, if it is not needed, please turn that vehicle off. We can utilize exhaust capture systems when vehicles are running inside the shop to minimize the amount of exhaust that is going to be inhaled by employees and that will be emitted to the outdoors. Making sure you keep lids closed on parts washers and chemical containers to minimize evaporation. If you're welding, utilize a small cog in order to capture some of the welding fumes that are produced by that task. And finally, equip stationary grinders with localized dust collector systems, again, to prevent that particulate from entering the atmosphere. Moving on to our next topic, we're going to be discussing hazardous waste. The Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, as well as state-run agencies have specific requirements which are set forth through the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as RCRA, for the handling, storage, transport, and disposal of hazardous wastes. Hazardous waste is broken down into two primary waste categories: characteristic hazardous waste and listed hazardous waste. Characteristic hazardous waste dictates that if a material that we are trying to dispose of has a certain characteristic, specifically it's either flammable or an oxidizer, it's corrosive, it's reactive, or it is toxic, it would need to be managed, treated, transported, stored, and disposed of as a hazardous waste. There's also what the EPA calls listed hazardous waste. Now, listed hazardous waste is specifically set out on a list that the EPA has set forth. Listed hazardous waste is broken down into four categories: non-specific source hazardous waste, specific source hazardous waste, acutely toxic hazardous waste, and unused chemicals. The primary source of hazardous waste at W.W. Williams is aerosol can. Aerosol can hazardous waste is minimized, however, through an aerosol can deflation system. All aerosol cans must be deflated prior to disposal or recycling. The disposal of an unpunctured aerosol can in the waste receptacles is a violation of the EPA's hazardous waste regulations. The method used to deflate aerosol cans at W.W. Williams is through an aerosol can deflation system pictured in the lower right-hand corner of your slide. Some things to keep in mind is, first and foremost, only personnel trained on the operation of this unit are permitted to utilize it. Secondly, we need to make sure you're wearing your personal protective equipment, which includes minimally chemical goggles, preferably a face shield, and chemical gloves. We need to verify that the filter is within the acceptable range. These filters are equipped with a colorimetric window that has a color decoder that will tell you when the filter needs to be replaced. And we also need to ensure that the grounding strap is secured to an acceptable ground. Copper grounding rods and structural steel are two examples of good grounds to connect that ground clamp to. The EPA breaks hazardous waste generators down into three primary categories. That is a large quantity, small quantity, and conditionally exempt small quantity generator. W.W. Williams sites are classified as a conditionally exempt small quantity generator of hazardous waste due to the low volume of hazardous waste produced. What this means is that we may not generate more than a monthly maximum of 220 pounds of hazardous waste, which is approximately 1/2 of a 55-gallon drum. We have a maximum storage limit of 2,200 pounds, or approximately 4 55-gallon drums. Due to our conditionally exempt small quantity generator status, there is no maximum storage duration for containers of hazardous waste, providing we do not exceed the 2,200 pounds. Some criteria with regards to the management of the hazardous waste containers themselves are, first off, our containers must be labeled. The three criteria that need to be placed on our label include the words hazardous waste, a description of the waste, for example with the aerosol system it would be aerosol can bottoms, and finally an accumulation start date, which is the date where we first starting adding material into that container. The Environmental Protection Agency also requires weekly hazardous waste inspections to be performed by trained workers. Specifically, what we are doing is we are documenting that we are looking at these containers and verifying that the containers are closed, properly labeled, appropriately grounded and bonded, that aisle spacing between containers is adequate, there's no evidence of leakage, damage, or container deterioration, verifying that filled containers have accumulation start dates, and making sure that the storage duration meets the timelines of our generator status. In order to dispose of hazardous waste, we must have the waste tested and profiled. And what that profile is going to do is it's going to dictate what types of treatment processes the disposal facility is going to have to run that waste through in order for it to be considered safe for disposal. The individuals actually shipping these waste containers off must be trained in the EPA's hazardous waste regulations, and they must also be trained under the Department of Transportation's hazardous materials regulations. When you ship these hazardous wastes off-site, you will be provided with a copy of what is known as a hazardous waste manifest. This manifest is a detailed shipping paper that is used to track that hazardous waste from the generator until the disposal facility. The next type of waste we're going to discuss is what's known as universal waste. In a nutshell, universal waste is in and of itself hazardous waste that the EPA gives a method to recycle, and if you are following those guidelines set forth under the management standards of universal waste, it is technically not considered a hazardous waste. Again, providing that we are recycling these materials. If it isn't recycled, we need to manage it as a hazardous waste. So specifically, universal waste consists of widespread, commonly disposed, easily managed, low-level hazardous wastes, which include fluorescent lamps, batteries, pesticides, mercury-containing devices, and electronic waste. The Environmental Protection Agency universal waste regulations dictate that this type of a waste stream is subject to a relaxed set of procedures in order to reduce regulatory burden if it is recycled. As I had touched on earlier, if not recycled, these waste streams must be managed as a hazardous waste. We are allowed to accumulate universal waste for up to 1 year from the accumulation start date. Labeling requirements for universal waste containers include the words universal waste, a description of the waste such as fluorescent bulbs. Finally, we need to mark these containers with an accumulation start date, which, much like hazardous waste, we need to place the date that the first bulb, the first battery, etc. was placed into that container. Now, as far as storage and container management goes, your containers must be stored so as to prevent the release of components or materials within that container. The containers must be structurally sound. I cannot emphasize this enough. They must remain closed. They need to be compatible with the waste that they are containing. And finally, they need to lack evidence of spillage. Another type of waste, which isn't truly a waste as long as we are recycling it, is what we call used oil. Used oil must be managed by the used oil management standards. Okay? And the used oil rule presumes that all used oil will be recycled. Again, much like universal waste, used oil that is not recycled must be characterized and may need to be treated as a hazardous waste. The containers holding the used oil should be marked with the words used oil, and it must be transported through a transporter who maintains an EPA identification number in order to transport used oil. Records of shipments of used oil must be maintained on site for a minimum period of 3 years. And our final topic of the day is basic spill response. The protocol to be followed in the event of a chemical spill is as follows. First off, due to the nature of most of the materials at W.W. Williams, we want to make sure we extinguish any and all ignition sources, whether that be an operating vehicle, a cigarette smoker, hot work going on in the area. We want to make sure that it is impossible for that spilled material to ignite. We would like to isolate the spill with socks, pads, and granular absorbent, making sure that as long as it is safe to do so, we keep the materials out of stormwater drains. If it is safe to do so, again, attempt to stop the spill at the source. For example, if we have a drum that was ruptured due to contact with a forklift fork, we can tip that drum onto its side with the damaged side facing up in order to stop the release of materials. We want to contact the site CSM so that way the notification process, if necessary, can start to take place. We want to reference the safety data sheet for the material that has been spilled in order to identify the proper spill response protocol. We want to recover and dispose of the spilled materials Again, keeping in mind that some of these materials that are recovered may need to be profiled and managed as a hazardous waste. We want to report the spill to regulatory agencies as needed. And as I touched on earlier, it's paramount that we keep these spilled materials out of storm drains. As long as we can recover that spilled material, whether it be through absorbent materials or excavation, as long as it is recoverable and it maintains on our property, we are going to limit the amount of impact it's going to have on the environment and the potential regulatory repercussions. So in summary, W.W. Williams aims to preserve natural resources through our environmental policy, which includes complying with regulatory standards and the prevention of pollution. All W.W. Williams employees are responsible for adhering to the requirements presented in this training. And if you are unsure, please make sure you ask questions. From all of us here at U.S. Compliance, we would like to thank you very much for attending our training on general environmental awareness. We hope that you were able to take away some new knowledge which you are able to apply in your work site in order to prevent the pollution of the environment.